I think that one of the most exciting things as I saw this agenda come together is, bringing together people from across the economic spectrum and others, of course, from both the macro side and the micro side to talk about this important question of inequality. And I think one of the things that I have taken away over the past day and a half of sessions is that how we think about distribution affects how we think about how the economy is functioning. In the earlier session today, Sandy Black was talking about monopsony as this new issue that labor economists are thinking about. And when you think about how that is so intimately connected to market concentration, to these macroeconomic trends of inequality, and who has the resources and what that means in terms of the power that they have in the economy, that this is something that labor economists have just sort of rediscovered after ignoring it for a little bit too long. That kind of intersection between the micro and macro is really just, I think, where some of the most interesting and exciting substantive areas of inquiry are in economics right now. So thrilled to be a part of this, and very excited to introduce the panelists for this next session, which is going to be focused on some of the more micro labor tools for labor market policy. And I think one of the challenge of the conversation we're going to have on this panel for our panelists is connecting the dots between these very micro tools, some of which have been around for a long time, some of which are going to be new ideas. How do these connect with the larger conversation we've been having over the past day and a half about how these larger trends in inequality both affect the toolbox that we have for improving the lives and the pay of workers, especially at the low end of the income distribution, and how do these trends in inequality affect the effectiveness of the tools? So I know that you all have that lovely 4 or 5 pager with everybody's bios, so I don't want to spend a lot of our very precious minutes going in deep, but allow me to just introduce the 3 folks we're going to have. First is Sandy Darity, William Darity Jr., who's a Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies and Economics, and the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. That was longer than I thought it was going to be when I started to read it, Sandy. Wow, that's great. David Ellwood, who's the Isabel and Scott Black Professor of Political Economy, who served as the Dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard from 2004 to 2015. And then third is Heidi Shierholz, who's a senior economist and director of policy at the Economic Policy Institute. So without any further ado, Sandy.
Thank you, Heather. And I'd also like to thank Danny and Olivier for inviting me to contribute to this convening. When Olivier first contacted me, he asked me to speak on the job guarantee. And then about 2 months ago, I asked him if I could change my topic to reparations, but he said he'd prefer if I stayed on the originally specified topic. So given the number of talks I've given about reparations lately, I think I'm glad Olivier kept me on the first course, but we'll see if I still feel that way after the question and answer period. I think that I don't want to describe the federal job guarantee as a micro tool. Let me start by saying a federal job guarantee can reduce income inequality, but it will have little effect on wealth inequality. It will affect income inequality by raising the incomes for persons at the lowest level of the earnings distribution. And it has a long history in the United States. It's very much of an American idea. The near precedents for a federal job guarantee are the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration during the Great Depression. The difference is that what's being proposed here is a permanent and universal program of job assurance. Franklin Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights in 1944 claimed that every American should have the right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nations, and the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation for their family members. Harry Truman's Fair Deal in 1949 echoed the same theme. Bayard Rustin prepared a freedom budget for the A. Philip Randolph Institute in 1967, which included a provision for a job guarantee. Both Martin Luther King Jr. and his partner Coretta Scott King endorsed a federal job guarantee. The Caucus of Black Economists, the predecessor of the National Economic Association, advocated a federal job guarantee in 1972. And the economist Sadie Moselle Alexander, who was the first Black PhD recipient in economics, in 1945 gave a speech at Florida A&M in which she talked about the racial implications of a federal job guarantee. The idiosyncratic economist Hyman Minsky, who introduced the notion of the financial instability hypothesis, referred to a federal job guarantee as an employer of last resort. And then there's a group of economists that emanate from the University of Missouri of Kansas City, Randall Wray, Matt Forstater, Stephanie Kelton, Pavlina Cherneva, who have placed a special emphasis on non-United States precedents for a job guarantee, the Jefas program in Argentina, and the Rural Employment Guarantee in India. There is a legal basis for the federal job guarantee that exists in the form of the unfunded mandate of the Humphrey-Hawkins Act of 1978. Essentially, a federal job guarantee would make Humphrey-Hawkins a funded mandate. Let me talk about some of the specifics of the form of a job guarantee that I have in mind. I would like to suggest that we establish a National Investment Employment Corps, the NIEC, where every American adult is assured of employment from the public sector. It would be federally funded and federally managed. It is not, strictly speaking, an employer of last resort, insofar as individuals would always have the option of taking these jobs regardless of their current employment status. So it is a permanent option or a permanent alternative to private sector employment. It is a large-scale direct hiring program by the federal government. In addition, the compensation would include a package of non-poverty wages so that the lowest paid jobs would be approximately $25,000 and would also have a benefits package similar to the one offered to all federal civil servants, including medical insurance. In addition, there would be job safety provisions and advancement opportunities built into the program. We would be able to meet the physical and human infrastructure needs of the society in a direct way through this public employment program. The human infrastructure dimensions include the professionalization of child and elder care, and this would be of particular significance, I believe, to women workers in the United States economy because they bear a disproportionate burden of trying to take care of the elderly and of children. In addition, we could have a team of teacher aides that could be part of the federal employment program, and we could have individuals who are in the program to work on repairing school facilities at the same time. We could rejuvenate the postal system in the United States. We could pursue solarization or greening of the nation's economy. We could match individual skills and talents with the particular types of jobs that they might pursue, as long as we're sufficiently imaginative. In the 1930s, under the Works Progress Administration, people were employed as muralists, as actors, as writers. In fact, it was in that period of time that the slave narratives that we have access today were gathered by employees of the WPA. In addition, we could combine a permanent, and I say this in quotation marks, we could combine a permanent with a fluid or cyclical staff that would man and woman the program. The program would function then as an automatic stabilizer, so it would expand in downturns and contract in upturns in strict accordion effect. But it would indeed moderate the impact of recessions and, in fact, provide some insulation from the effects of recessions because of the fact that it could expand in periods of economic downturn. The effects of this type of program would be to create a floor on compensation and job quality. This would be somewhat different from relying exclusively upon minimum wage or living wage laws. Wage floors are only useful to individuals who actually have work. And even if you have a job, wage floors don't ensure enough hours for individuals to qualify for benefits packages. The goal of a federal job guarantee is essentially to wipe out bad jobs. The EITC, or a universal basic income, potentially can de facto subsidize the private sector's creation of bad jobs. Indeed, I think the EITC needs to be retained in the context of a federal job guarantee to address the limitations of incomes that people earn above the poverty level. But generally, anti-poverty measures require people to be exposed to poverty before income support mechanisms are activated. The federal job guarantee is predicated on the view that we want to keep people from experiencing poverty in the first place. In addition, we could reduce anti-poverty expenditures that exist today, since the federal job guarantee could function simultaneously as a full employment program as well as an anti-poverty program. So when I'm not in my modern monetary theory mode, I would argue that the job guarantee is almost revenue neutral. Okay. The best estimates that we've been able to construct is that the maximum cost of the program would be in the vicinity of $750 billion to $1.5 trillion. And this is roughly equivalent to the magnitude of the overall anti-poverty budget. And furthermore, the federal job guarantee would produce less inflationary pressure than the pure income transfer programs like a universal basic income, because there would be actual production of goods and services associated with the public jobs system. It addresses income inequality, as I said, by lifting the bottom of the earnings distribution. It ensures decent employment for groups who are subjected to discriminatory exclusion or underpayment. This would include folks who are excluded on the basis of race, veteran status, gender, disability, or ex-felon status. In effect, we would assure employment for all categories of those individuals. They would always be able to get a job. Now, this may be a pro or a con, but the Federal Reserve could be more aggressive in fighting inflation if it's so desired. It would no longer be necessary to worry about determining what the natural rate of unemployment is or the non-inflationary rate of unemployment. And so I'll conclude with this observation. This is the final word. The federal job guarantee would make the Phillips curve vertical at a zero rate of unemployment.
I want to start by sharing two graphs with you that you've all already seen, more or less, and know by heart. But the first is, it's a slight variation, like you see, which is going to look at the distribution of real wage and salary earnings of full-time workers, male workers in this case, 18 to 64. So it's deals with unemployment. Most of the time when we see these graphs these days, it's often done by education. And the problem with that is if you look over time, the number of people in the bottom is getting smaller and smaller, and so you're sweeping out. This way, we're just going to look by percentiles. And again, it's the percent change since 1991 for these different groups. And so here we go. And this is essentially what we saw was, in fact, the 60s to the early 70s, and it goes back to the 40s, really was the rising tide lifting all boats. And then starting in about 1930, it just really spread out. You can tilt this graph a little bit by using different, cost of living adjusters and all that sort of stuff. If you take it a few more years forward, it gets a little worse, and then it seems like it's getting better in the last year or so. But it's basically this trend. And if the median worker is more or less flat or up slightly, depending on what you include, a bottom and so on. You've seen all this before, but I want to come back to it in a second. The other one you've probably seen before is this graph, which is if we ask how this comes from, Raj Chetty and the whole crowd at the Opportunity Institute, which is the percent of children by the year they were born who earn more than their parents. And people born in the 1940s, it was like 90%. Not a big surprise if everybody's wages are going up, it's very likely. And then it declines, and now it's like 50%. If you looked at the fraction of boys or young men who earn more than their parents did at the same age, it's less than 50%. Now, the reason to start with these two charts is to think about what it really means for the country and for politics. I would argue these two charts tell us more about our politics, the anger, the frustration, the bitterness in this country and to some degree around the world, since these graphs are less dramatic but similar, I suspect, in many places. The basic story is this isn't fair. And the idea is, look, I thought that if I work hard, I play by the rules, I'm going to do better, and my kids are going to do even better. And if that's not happening, then it feels very frustrating to me, and I've got to blame somebody. And who should I blame? Well, let's blame the Chinese. Let's blame the immigrants. Let's blame the people of color. Let's blame the people that aren't me. Who are them who are making all this pain for me? And by the way, it's especially those elites in Washington, those economists who said, look, all you have to do, this trade and immigration, all these technological changes, don't worry. It's going to work out. Yes, there'll be some pain initially, but eventually we can all gain by this, and there'll be adjustments, and yeah, we'll have trade adjustment assistance and so forth. And they say, it's like it's been 30 years. At what point do we throw you bums out? And I think that's where we're at. And I think that a lot of the stuff we've been talking about makes me nervous that it'll be another 30 years before they can see something. So what I want to talk about is three things. The first is, I'm going to argue that making work pay is an absolutely essential strategy. Second, and I'll spend less time on these two, although they're bigger, I really believe the low-wage, low-skill market functions quite poorly. This is more speculative than detail. And then finally, I think one of the critical things we need to think much more about is how we turn the so-called bad jobs into good jobs. So, quickly, making work pay is an essential strategy. So I'm going to talk about why it is for practical economics reasons, for reasons of politics, and for reasons of values. And for practical economics, the obvious question is, do you want to do something about inequality in my lifetime? Now, some of you are younger than me, so maybe in your lifetime, but in my lifetime. And the answer is a lot of the by the way, I'm on board for all these cool policies that I've heard. I mean, almost all of them. I really want the German, by the way, labor market system here. I really want to do much more to reduce the taxes on labor income and raise them for capital. Certainly I'm worried about climate change, et cetera, et cetera. But the number of these things that really are going to affect this generation of workers, who, by the way, are raising the next generation of children, is very low. And so the question is, what are we going to do about that? And the nice thing about make work pay strategies is that you can do them now. The other point I would just say, if you're really trying to do something now, well, there are some stuff we've talked about. Larry Katz and others talked about, these new training programs. We finally have some training programs for workers in the United States that seem to have some pretty big incomes, impacts. The very best, the best of the best, seems like it may increase income by 20 or even 30% for some groups. So that's like good. But of course, getting that to scale, will it happen at scale? How much of this is sorting people into jobs as opposed to upgrading everything is an important question. The Earned Income Tax Credit is an automatic increase in pay. It basically is an earnings credit, as most of you know. It's a refundable tax credit. For every dollar you earn at first, you can get up to 40% more in a refundable tax credit. So right away, that's 40%, which is better than anything else we've talked about. It, by the way, is both pro-worker and pro-market. It's like, it's a kind of not as good as a wage subsidy in many ways, but it has some advantages also. And so not only does it raise wages, it's theoretically it should promote more work as well rather than less. The next one is obviously the minimum wage. Now, of course, it's much more controversial, although it's making a comeback in no small measure because we now are talking about monopsony power. The joy of monopsony is if you raise wages, it will increase employment rather than decrease employment. So that's a good reason. Part of it is just constraining firms. I actually believe in the low-wage labor market. Firms don't have a lot of constraints on them. They don't have the pressures from unions or anybody else, even culture. And on the other hand, it's very weakly targeted. The vast majority of people who get in the minimum wage are kids and people that aren't poor. And of course, there is always the worry of unemployment. And then the other parts of things we've heard some about already. But don't forget portability of benefits. If you want to prorate them, I like that idea from Laura Tyson. But maternity leave, sick leave, healthcare, all these things can really make work pay. And we can do that in a way that makes a huge difference in a relatively modest period of time. Not all of these are easy politically, but I would argue that supporting work is way more popular than almost any other way to support lower income folks. And I'll just tell you, one of the other things that I did in life at one point, for a while I worked in the Clinton administration, and I was one of the co-chairs of our effort on welfare reform. And it had two really major elements. The first was make work pay, this kind of stuff. And the second was we were going to reform the cash assistance, the public assistance program, by tying it to employment and to education and employment and training programs and so forth, ultimately expecting people to work, but guaranteeing a job if they couldn't find one in the private sector. Okay, Bill Clinton called this, President Clinton to me, called this the end of welfare as we know it. Well, I think the history has shown we very much succeeded in ending welfare. As we know it, you don't need that. The first thing to go was the guaranteed jobs. That didn't even get very far past the president's desk. Next, the idea that, we would give cash benefits to people. Can't do that forever because people might not, well, whatever. So eventually at this stage, we arrive at a point where we basically have very little. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have aid. It morphed into food aid and especially health aid. So we're perfectly willing to help in certain kinds of things, but cash is like really questionable. So in-kind benefits, they're credible. We've certainly expanded them dramatically in recent years, but cash. And I very much enjoy the current discussion about universal basic income. I'm on board. I'm for it. But let me tell you a story of how I think it goes. Let's say, and by the way, I love Greg Mankiw's little diagram. It's great. But notice even Harvard undergraduates went for the so-called targeted one, even though it was an illusion. And what happens first is they say, wait a minute, $12,000 a year you're going to give to Bill Gates? No, you don't want to do that. No, we don't want to give it to Bill Gates. So, and then you say, and that gradually goes down. And then you sort of say, then we heard from Greg Mankiw some great stories. Well, how about Sammy Surfer and Drinking David? Okay, they say, look, I got 12 grand, I can surf. I mean, and there's going to be stories about that. And then I'm Drinking David is like, listen, whatever. So guess what happens? We start putting rules on it. We start restricting it. We start phasing it out. We start doing all this. Pretty soon it looks just like the welfare program that I had to try and fix and failed. So, and then finally, values. Work is still in this country very much seen as conferring dignity. It's part of the reason it's popular politically, but it's also very much kind of who you are. And it's a sense of being connected to the community. And let me just tell you one anecdote which illustrates this. This comes from ethnographic work by Kathy Eden, which is she talks about how people love, low-income folks, love the EITC, and they hate, like, whatever, food stamps, SNAP, welfare, whatever. They love the EITC because they say, well, they hate the other one first because you go in, you're treated like dirt, they act like you're a failure, we're going to help you, but now we own you. The EITC, you work some, you go in, and these folks, it turns out, go to H&R Block to do their taxes, even though it costs them more than the church will do it, but they do it because they say this: I got people. That's the tagline for H&R Block, or was. I got people I'm treated like a customer, and they walk out and say, I pay taxes too. They, of course, don't. Negative taxes is what they pay, but yeah, I'm part of this society. I'm valued. I have meaning. And the notion that work conveys dignity and community and how you're valued is absolutely central. And so that's really my claim. Making work pay is essential. So quickly, low wage labor markets. Part of a recent thing I did, I've been all over the country doing site visits and so forth, meeting with lots of low wage workers. And whatever misgivings I had about the low wage workforce has been amplified manyfold. And I basically think there is no place where information is in shorter supply and more poorly applied than the low wage labor market. First of all, on individual work equality, another story from ethnographers, very, very common story. You've worked at Walmart or pick a store, pick someplace for 3 or 4 years. You've been really reliable. You've hardly missed a day. You've been terrific and so forth. Your brother borrows your truck and neglects to mention to you that he used up all the gas. So you get on the road, you run out of gas. You don't have money for gas. So what do? Well, you don't show up for 3 days. Walmart says, gee, I'm sorry, you've been a good worker and all that, but we really sorry, we just don't, we'll have to let you go. That's just our rules. And so this was a good worker. He had bad luck on somebody else and so forth. That information is lost to the system forever. You might see it on his CV right. No one's going to call Walmart and ask how he did. And no one is going to then tell them, because Walmart will say, oh no, we're not allowed to talk about our workers. They might verify they work there. Similarly, workers have no idea about the quality of the jobs and whether this job leads anywhere. Ask yourself this, if someone came to you and said, look, college is not for me right now. I'd like to do some work. I'd like to work at something that has a future. What advice would you give them? And where would you get that advice? And if you wanted to look something up, where would you look? How would you know whether starting at Dunkin' Donuts is better than starting at, at some janitorial firm or whatever? And finally, we have lots of teaching and training institutions. We have community colleges. They are the best and worst institutions in this country, and we can't tell very well. So you don't even know how to get to the next level. And then finally, I think it's probably getting worse because of outsourcing and alternative work arrangements. You used to learn about workers because they were working for you in low jobs. And then finally, in terms of potential solutions, I think that's a really hard question, but I do think institutions have got to be part of the answer. We have really crappy institutions in this area, and they should be good. We don't use data and technology here at all. I mean, what if Raj Chetty used his data not to ask what neighborhood where it leads you, but what about what job leads you? Where does that lead? What might we learn from that? And finally, information sharing. Lastly, and I really am stealing time at this moment, I want to talk about turning bad jobs into good jobs. When you actually go and look at the low-wage labor market, there are a ton of these jobs that we actually think are unbelievably important jobs. I'm a recent grandfather. I'm very proud of myself for not mentioning it till this moment. And there's no pictures, which is even more impressive. But stop me afterwards. I am not ready. I have 2 daughters. They both have children. Robots don't really seem like a good solution to childcare. And I don't think they're going to be good for my mother, who's in the nursing home and all this sort of stuff. And by the way, food service workers and waiters, and there's just a ton of things that we actually think are really important. The care of my grandchildren, nothing is more important to me than that. And yet we have made that into a very bad job. It doesn't pay well, it doesn't lead anywhere, or whatever. And these are not jobs that are going to go away. The robots aren't coming. We're not going to send my kids to China, and so on. Immigrant labor, maybe, but and so one quick story about the fact that it is possible to do this. The U.S. military, that bastion of progressivity, actually it is a pretty good bastion of progressivity these days, discovered an interesting regularity. When people, this is about 10 years ago, when people came back from deployments overseas, 9 months later, this says stop now, so I'm just let you know I'm being bad. Almost done. when 9 months later, there was a baby boom. No one could figure out why that regularity existed after coming back from a deployment, but there it was. And it turned out that when people, when they wanted to send these folks back, they weren't very happy about going because they had crappy childcare. So the military decided, well, we've got to have really good childcare. There was even an Inspector General report, remember when he took those seriously, that said, this is a terrible system. And so what did they do? They said, we got to have A-class childcare. What are they going to be? It's going to be terrific facilities. We're going to hire somebody to lead them that's well-trained. We're going to train the workers to deal with the unique situation that faces children whose parents are away for extended periods and maybe in harm's way. And finally, we're going to have to raise their wages by 30% because having trained them, we don't want to lose them. Well, that was a win 4 ways. It was a win for the military. They wouldn't have done it. It was a win for the parents. It was a win for the kids. And it was a win for the workers. That's turning a bad job into a good job. And so I'll just end on this. I think you got to think about making, whoops, I guess I really will end on this. Very well done. But it's about pay. It's about protection and voice. It's about figuring out how to create job ladders, again, where they're if we really are losing the middle, what's happening to the job ladders from the bottom? And finally, it's ultimately about thinking carefully about which jobs we really want to give the respect that they really deserve as opposed to making them invisible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so this session is about labor market tools, and I'm going to focus on one sort of often overlooked but very important component of labor market tools, their enforcement. Because even if we have the most optimally designed system of employment protections, if there's not strong enforcement to go along with it, they will mean nothing. And so to motivate this, I mean, lots of these, the things we've heard already have already motivated this discussion, but to further motivate this discussion, I will first, wait, I cannot see my notes. I will first give examples of violations of worker protections and what we know about how prevalent they are. Spoiler alert, they are pretty prevalent. And so I will then talk about why those things might be so prevalent and then talk about what kind of enforcement system could we set up that would help incentivize employers to comply with the law rather than shirk their responsibilities. So because the time is short, and I will try to stick to my time, I promise, I'm going to focus everything around violations of wage and hour laws. So I will refer to that as wage theft throughout this report, but everything I talk to can pretty much also apply to health and safety standards, to protections against employment discrimination, and to labor law and everything else. Okay, so first, some examples of wage theft to just provide everybody, so everyone has a sense of really what we're talking about now. The most obvious form of wage theft is when someone is paid below the minimum wage. I will talk a little bit more in a second about what we know about how extensive that is. But another thing that includes is when employers misclassify employees as independent contractors, and then they don't comply with wage and hour laws like the minimum wage because they feel like they've been able to evade them. So not being paid the minimum wage. Another is not being paid for the hours that you work. This kind of thing is really prevalent. Say you are working late at a convenience store and your supervisor says, clock out and then clean up. That's a form of wage theft. For overtime eligible workers, not being paid time and a half when you work more than 40 hours a week is wage theft. Illegal deductions from pay. So employers can't, for example, deduct the cost of a uniform from a worker's paycheck if that means that they then make less than the minimum wage, but that sort of thing happens. Tip theft by employers and supervisors. Tips are legally the property of workers. They cannot be taken by employers or supervisors, but they can pretty easily end up in the wrong hands. So those are the kinds of things I'm going to be sort of referring to throughout when I talk about wage theft. So how extensive is this problem? There is not a lot of data on this, but what we have shows it's pretty extensive. So there was a survey of 4,300 workers in low-wage industries in Chicago, LA, and New York. And what it found is that of the workers surveyed, 2/3 experienced at least one pay-related violation in any given week, and that violation amounted to 15% of their earnings. So putting those numbers together, on average, the low-wage workers in those places reported losing about 10% of their earnings to wage theft. Some of my colleagues at EPI looked at the BLS current population survey and just compared wages of workers who are eligible for the minimum wage to the minimum wage that they were subject to, and found that total wages stolen from workers due to minimum wage violations alone exceeds $15 billion annually. And just sort of extrapolating from existing studies, a very back-of-the-envelope estimate suggests that in aggregate, low-wage workers lose on the order of $50 billion a year to all forms of wage theft. And just to add a little context to that, according to the FBI, the total value of all robberies, burglaries, larceny, and motor vehicle theft is $13 billion annually. Federal, state, and local governments spend tremendous resources to combat property crime, and I'll get to this in a little bit, but in contrast, lawmakers allocate far, far fewer resources to combating wage theft, even though the problem is much larger in magnitude. So that brings us to the next point. Why is wage theft so prevalent? I'm just going to go through a few key possibilities. So one thing this all highlights, and it's been talked about throughout this conference, is monopsony power. The fact that this employer behavior is not competed away underscores that for a variety of reasons, these workers do not have the ability to quit these jobs as a form of enforcement. And there are simply not enough government resources devoted to addressing this. So federal resources for the enforcement of worker protections have declined. Of course, the US workforce has grown. So for example, in 1978, there were 69,000 workers per wage and hour investigator on average. Today, that ratio is 175,000 to 1. One wage and hour investigator for every 175,000 workers. This means that there is a very, very low chance that any violator will get caught. So this low chance of getting caught combined with extremely low penalties that are in place for violations mean that there is almost no financial incentive for companies to comply with the law. I think it is not a stretch to say our system of worker protections largely relies on managerial goodwill for its enforcement. So that's the government piece. At the same time, government resources for enforcement are dwindling. An increasing number of corporations are forcing their employers to sign away their rights to their private right to pursue justice in court if their employer violates their rights through mandatory arbitration. So in mandatory arbitration, I, as the employer, require you, as the worker, as a condition of employment, to sign a contract that says that if I violate your rights, if I do not pay you the wages you're owed under the law, if I sexually harass you, if I discriminate against you on the base of your race, if I don't follow safety regulations, you cannot bring me to court. You cannot sue me in court. Instead, disputes must be resolved by a private arbitrator that is chosen by the employer, where the arbitrator typically knows that if they rule in favor of the employer, they are more likely to get future business from that employer. So unsurprisingly, the outcomes for workers in this setting are much, much worse than outcomes for workers in the court of law. But mandatory arbitration is widespread and growing. Survey data shows that today more than half of private sector non-union workers are subject to mandatory arbitration agreements, and that's up from less than 8% 25 years ago. So doing just a very back-of-the-envelope extrapolation, I project that within 5 years, more than 80% of private sector non-union workers will be subject to mandatory arbitration. Further, this will go on and on, right? Recent Supreme Court decisions gave the green light to mandatory arbitration with class and collective action waivers. So why is that a problem? Class actions are an essential component of private enforcement because individual lawsuits are often unrealistic for low and even middle wage workers because the cost of the litigation, the cost of the legal representation typically exceeds the lost wages. Class and collective actions allow workers to aggregate their claims, making the cost making the litigation cost effective. So to underscore the importance of class action lawsuits in our enforcement framework, in 2015 and 2016, the top 10 private wage and hour class action settlements alone exceeded the combined total wages recovered by all state and federal enforcement agencies. Mandatory arbitration with class and collective action waivers makes it virtually impossible for low-wage workers to get any meaningful type of remedy. So given the low government funding for enforcement, mandatory arbitration removes essentially all remaining financial incentives companies have to comply with the law. Another contributor to pervasive violations is workplace fissuring. This is also known as domestic outsourcing. David Weil, who's the dean of the Heller School at Brandeis, coined this word fissuring, and when he explains it, he uses a great example that I'm going to borrow now. So it used to be, when you walked into a hotel, basically everyone who's working in that hotel is employed by the firm whose name is on the front of that hotel. But since around the 80s, employers have begun contracting out for many services, and particularly labor-intensive services. So instead of housekeepers and janitors and landscapers and laundry workers and HR workers being employed by the hotel contracts out for those services. So where you used to have just the lead firm, the hotel setting the wages of these workers, now you have all these satellite wage setters who are all competing on price for contracts. And their biggest cost is labor costs. So cheap contracts mean that contractors face great pressure to cut corners on labor costs, including through violating violating labor and employment laws. Okay, and then the final reason, the final reason I'll discuss for prevalent violations of worker protections is declining unionization. We've talked about this, but a key thing is that unionized workers are much less likely to be victims of wage theft and other violations because unions provide support, leverage, representation to workers in claiming their rights, along with protections against retaliatory firing. Over the last 40 years, the share of workers covered by a collective bargaining agreement has dropped from over 25% to less than 12%. So one of the things this means is that many, many fewer workers get the benefits of combating violations that unions provide. So those are the reasons why we're seeing such pervasive violations of employment protection. So I will quickly cover what we need to put in place to have an effective enforcement system that would incentivize employers to comply with the law rather than shirk. So the most obvious thing is we need more resources to go to enforcement of worker protections. In addition to the very, very obvious things like we just need more wage and hour investigators, there are a bunch of more novel things that can be taken up that are being experimented with in some states. So for example, state attorneys general offices can help protect workers' rights. Some have set up labor branches and are using their authority to enforce state laws to do things like investigate and file suit against companies who are cheating their workers. We also need to ban mandatory arbitration and class and collective action waivers in labor and employment matters. Employers should not be able to ask their workers to sign away their right to their last layer of enforcement, the courts. So a ban on mandatory arbitration can be done by federal legislation. In the meantime, states can and are enacting what are known as whistleblower enforcement laws, that they allow workers who are subject to mandatory arbitration to sue lawbreaking employers on behalf of the state, because the state actually cannot be forced to arbitrate. So it's a cumbersome way to do it, but it's sort of a workaround while mandatory arbitration remains legal. Okay, the impact of workplace fissuring on wage theft can be counteracted by strong joint employer standards. And let me back up a step on this. As employers outsource various functions to contractors and subcontractors, it has become more and more possible for lead firms to evade liability for labor standards violations. So one solution is that all firms who share control over the terms and conditions of a worker's job, like all firms who share control over things like pay, over things like schedules, over things like job duties, they should all be considered employers of that worker or joint employers. Lead firms who are legally joint employers with their contractors would then not, for example, be able to put pressure on those contractors to cut corners with labor costs without facing liability for violations themselves. All right, so then this next thing was covered in the last panel, so I'm not going to talk about it a lot, but it's worth mentioning that another way to boost enforcement is to boost unionization, so more workers get the protections against violations that workers provide. And one thing I just always want to mention along these lines is that the decline of unions has not been a natural phenomenon. More people report that they want to be in unions now than 40 years ago, so it's not that workers don't want them. The within sector erosion of union coverage is more important to explaining the decline of union coverage than changes in industry composition. So it hasn't just been the shift to services. I think the decline of unionization has been due in large part to massively increased employer aggressiveness in fighting union organizing, and labor law has just not evolved to counteract that. And the last panel mentioned this, but that's the sort of thing that we could change. Another very simple thing to do to boost enforcement is that all employers could be required to provide workers with statements of pay that include, among other things, the name of the employers, the workers' employers, and employer or employers, the rate of pay, the hours worked, all deductions from pay. When employers were required to provide workers with written notice of their terms of employment, which perhaps surprisingly is not required in most places, it helps reduce the non-compliance that results from it just being easy for employers to hide violations, and it provides employees with necessary documentation to pursue a claim in the event of a violation. And then lastly, I just want to add that every year, the government spends hundreds of billions of dollars on contracts, from everything from building interstate highways to serving concessions at national parks. The Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs at the Department of Labor estimates that roughly a quarter of all U.S. workers work at firms that receive one or more government contracts. Currently, there is no effective system in place to ensure that taxpayer dollars are not awarded to chronic violators of workers' rights. The law should require that contractors competing for federal contracts disclose previous workplace violations. Agencies could independently firm that disclosure, and those violations should be able to be considered when awarding new contracts. So in other words, we should just use government procurement as an enforcement tool. So I will leave it there. I just hope this has been sort of a useful window into the importance of enforcement in designing effective labor market tools.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Thank you for a riveting panel of depressing things. I feel like the title of this panel should have been all of the frustrations we have with what's going on in the low-wage labor market and our inability to fix it. But maybe that would have been too much of a downer and nobody would have stayed for it. So I want to start with just one kind of overarching observation that, and a question that I want to pose to all three of you, that I pulled out of all three of your discussions. All of your discussions in various ways underscored the importance of execution in the effectiveness of government policy. I mean, David, you talked about how when you were in the Clinton administration, you had this vision for what welfare reform was going to be, and that wasn't what actually came in to be. Sandy, you talked about a set of policies that we once had to protect workers with a job guarantee that we have no longer. And of course, Heidi's talk was all about enforcement. And I wanted to just start with a little bit of a question around how can we think about this question of the effectiveness of government to engage in the low-wage labor market and to do these things? And as you all were talking, I was ruminating on the political science panel yesterday morning and, people's lack of faith in government, and just was wondering if we could connect the dots a little bit. So maybe starting with you, Heidi, but how can we think about making sure that these policies that we're focusing on the bottom can actually be put in place? Is that all political, or are there other ideas or solutions you want to put on the table?
feels like the kind of thing that's happening here today and more is what's super important. Like, we have to get people who are dreaming up the policies with people who are on the ground and know what implementation might look like. So just huge collaboration between people at agencies that know what needs to be done really on the ground with people who are really doing the policy development and can sort of optimally design things. That combination is what is absolutely crucial in order to get something that will both work and then last going forward.
Just a couple of things. First, I wouldn't be so depressed on make work pay stuff. It's happening all over the place. I mean, the earned income tax credit was expanded dramatically during Clinton years, but it's been expanded since as well. And many states are doing things ranging from, various forms of maternity leave and a variety of other kinds of things. And again, I think it speaks to the popularity of work. And again, whoever is going to successfully raise the several $1 trillion, I remember when $1 trillion was a lot of money, if they'd be willing to give me like a third of that, I could just transform the low-wage labor market. And I think it would be much more popular, honestly. But the other point I would make is there are actually organizations that are union-like that are starting. One of the things that I think is really invaluable in this field is actually to go out and do site visits, to talk to folks like I mentioned. But one of the great groups out there is, for example, the National Domestic Workers Union. Ai-jen Poo runs it and so forth. That's a union where there should not be a union. It's National Domestic Workers Alliance, I'm sorry. But it's in some ways a union. It's like people that are the most invisible workers in our society. They're often care workers. They're doing miserable jobs. They're often immigrants. Some of them are not here, with papers, all that stuff. And yet they've had real impact by partly just by making it visible so people understand, and partly by saying, we all have these problems with, our caring for our children or caring for our parents, whatever else. We should have government programs that provide more benefits to that. Medicaid should be allowed to cover it and so forth. And that's an argument that people find compelling, particularly when they themselves are finding it very difficult to find the services and so forth they need. And I think one last thing, I do think it'll be, is a hopeful time in one way. We are, the aging of the population and everything else means we are going to have real shortages of a lot of these care work and all those other kinds of things. And so I think change immigration policy and so on. So I think there will be more desire to figure out a way to solve this problem. But it will need the government. I mean, you can't raise wages on child care workers and expect people who are poorly paid to buy the child care. I mean, it's going to require some of that.
So are you recommending subsidies?
One of the things the National Domestic Workers Alliance talks about is, again, having Medicare cover various kinds of home health care, but also some sorts of child care. If you had a universal child care benefit that was heavily subsidized by the government, yeah, it's money, but it's nothing compared to some of the money. One of the great things about working on the Earned Income Tax Credit is done by the Treasury Department instead of the Department of Health and Human Services. And in the Treasury Department, a $30 billion program is a rounding error. Whereas in the Health and Human Services, it's like $30 billion if you lost your mind. So I think there are ways to get there, but I do think, it will require political will, but you are actually seeing in places as diverse, certainly in purple states, a real activity in that domain.
So I think the premise behind a job guarantee is that we want to give everyone an exit option from a bad job. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of political support for that, surprisingly so, to the extent that I'm baffled why more of the candidates are not pushing the idea of a job guarantee. A plurality of all Americans have supported a federal government assurance of work for all who want a job, provided by direct employment. And there was a nation poll of individuals who were voters that indicated that there was a net support for the job guarantee of 43% from voters 18 to 34, 22% from voters 35 to 64, and 8% from voters 65 and older. And even 32% of Trump voters actually support a federal job guarantee. And so I think that there's any policy can be overturned by a hostile regime, but if there is significant grassroots support for that policy, that creates pressure for it to be executed properly, even under a hostile regime. So I think the key thing is the question of how much political support there is for it among the population at large. And I think the evidence is that there's significant support for a federal job guarantee.
Let me ask you another question about your plan, Sandy. When you were talking about the wage floor, I wasn't sure that I understood whether or not you were proposing that everyone was paid the same or if there was some sort of job ladder. And then the second, probably associated question is, it seems like what you're talking about is in many ways could be seen as just as an expansion of our public sector, right? So that your part of your plan seems to be thinking about the public sector employment as a way to bring in all of these people. So are you imagining that this is how do you see this connecting with civil service jobs that we already have? I think what I kind of took away from your panels, there was a meshing of those, but tease that out for us a little bit.
Well, what I had in mind is that the array of jobs that would be taken up through the job guarantee would be distinct from the types of jobs that are already managed by civil servants at all three levels of government. And in particular, I was trying to highlight the human infrastructure jobs that might be associated with a professionalized workforce that's providing child and elder care. There were some other examples, but that's something that we don't do on a national basis through federal employment at the moment. And so that's something that I think would be a very distinct set of occupations that are not currently covered. It is striking, though, that 15% of all employed Americans hold public sector jobs. And I think in the absence of public sector employment, we would have a permanent unemployment crisis in the United States. And so my view is that we could raise that percentage to 25 or 30%, and incorporate a new range of employment opportunities for people that are not currently handled by the public sector. The competition here is with the private sector. So I would be very glad to reproduce some of the jobs or work that's performed in the private sector with superior pay and superior work conditions, because that's the premise. We want to compel the private sector to improve the quality of jobs that it offers, and this is the way to do it.
So I'm going to ask one more question. I'm going to throw this one to Heidi, and then I'll open it up to the audience. Heidi, you at the very beginning of your remarks, you talked about how there's not a lot of data, and I was wondering if you had any recommendations or thoughts on how we could make sure that we had more data on issues like wage theft and enforcement.
Oh, that's a really good question. So I don't have a dream list, but like the survey that I mentioned that asked 4,300 low-wage workers in Chicago and LA and New York what their experience with wage theft is, that was done in 2008. Like it's old. I mean, I think things aren't any better now than they were then, but it's just, we don't have enough. So this is incredibly policy relevant stuff. It's incredibly important to know how these things are playing out. So I would just encourage any and everyone who wants to dig in on this, that we don't have enough information and we need it.
So opening it up to the floor, Olivier.
Two questions, one to Sandy and one to David. To Sandy, you did not answer the question that Heather asked you, or part of a question that she asked you, which is about, is it a floor or is it a job ladder? And if it's a job ladder, then it seems to me that becomes a very big issue, because it's going to have major effects on the private sector job ladder. And so I want to know where you stand on that. Okay. On David, one of the reasons I wanted this session was to think about the joint use of the minimum wage and the ITC. And I have a sense that you need both, because if you have the ITC without the minimum wage, then the incidence will be a lower wage for workers, so you need a floor, and then you use the ITC from then on. Is your sense that at this stage we have the right mix of the two? And if we wanted to be more generous, would you go for a higher minimum wage, which is clearly less fiscally costly, or a higher EITC?
I've always liked the combination, and partly for the reason that you say, partly just because politically it's a nice combination. But I would say I'm seeing the various kinds of monopsony things. Look, I was trained by Richard Freeman, and I think he's like a genius. But I too sort of thought, like, explain to me how all these little employers are like collaborating. And I think some of it is, in effect, the same way the airline industry used to, with price leadership and so on. But under those conditions, then a minimum wage makes a lot of sense. And I think that one of the other things, partly because of the low-wage labor market, I do think works so poorly. I think part of the reason we finally got some training programs at work is that they're really specifically focused on specific employers. It maybe we're just making that match happen, not much more. And I think so. I would generally say it's a weak answer, but I think both. I don't have a magic number. I'm not going to pretend there's the right one, and obviously it feels a little different in Seattle than it does in some other areas. But I like you. I think that you need both. Now, I would say I will just make one minor amendment. The EITC does not go to every low-wage worker equally. Some workers, it's based on the family size. So one of the advantages of the EITC is you can have a wage that is related to need in some fashion. For a long time, very little money went to childless couples or individuals. And so because of that, since not every worker gets it, the impact on employers is ambiguous. Okay, if I'm not going to probably specialize in parents. So the fact that parents get more than non-parents, and again, partly there's just enough stuff sloshing around in the labor market that it's not even close to 1-for-1. And so it is very clear, I think, in the data that this really has raised the real earnings of folks, even in a period where the minimum wage has been pretty stagnant or falling in real terms.
So I think of this as a program that incorporates job ladders. It's not exclusively a floor. But the floor is the bottommost wages that would be offered in the program. And if you combine approximately a $25,000 figure with an additional $10,000 in benefits, we're talking about $35,000. In the estimates of the program that we've generated, we assume either that the total cost per worker would be either $50,000 to $60,000 because of materials, training requirements, as well as the higher wages that would have to be paid to individuals who are further up the job ladder, who would be engaged in the training or the monitoring or the management activities. And so that's why I made a distinction between kind of the permanent workforce and the fluid or cyclical workforce, because it would be the individuals who are in quotes, in the more permanent positions, who would have access to the promotion opportunities and greater continuity in the program. And I guess I'm not particularly disturbed if this has strong ripple effects on the private sector.
Yes, over here.
Okay, from Sandy, I would like to know what would happen to EITC in his scheme. Would it remain as it is, or would he need to scrap it in order to fund at least part of his scheme? And from David, I would like to know what he thinks of Sandy's scheme.
So I don't have a really good answer yet because I haven't thought it through entirely, but it's my understanding that EITC applies to income earners whose levels of income are above the minimum that I established. And so I would think that EITC would presumably have to continue for those categories of incomes that are above the threshold, to the extent that we think it's desirable to supplement people's incomes. And we may be able to reduce the amounts of EITC payments if we take into account the fact that all of the employees in this public sector apparatus would have full benefits. And that's not necessarily the case for individuals who are earning higher incomes, but don't necessarily have the same kind of benefits package. There would be an adjustment. But I'm definitely not thinking that we would eliminate EITC altogether, although we could eliminate other types of programs like unemployment compensation.
So to the first part of your question, I think the estimates for the ITC next year are in the range of $70 billion. You were talking trillions, so it's not, in theory, it's
not a big amount.
not much. In terms of my views, I guess my views are illustrated both by the fact that when I went to Washington working with the Clinton administration, the idea was we'd make cash benefits time limited with an expectation people go to work, but have a guaranteed job of last resort. And Laura was there, others. Even within the Clinton administration, people who are now on television, supporting many people that many of you probably like, would say, wait a minute, these people have a guaranteed job? Nobody else in the country has a guaranteed job. We can't do that. That was within the Clinton administration at a different time. And it was really, and I said, wait, we were giving them cash. We're just now saying instead of cash, you got to work. And then if you can't work. So it was not, it was a very, very hard sell in that kind of setting. And I think the kind of thing that Sandy's talking about, which is in some ways even more attractive, because again, I just think that the kind of resources and so forth would be very hard to I would really worry about where it would ultimately come out when it came out of the sausage factory. Then the final part is it's like everything. It's a really hard sell in this country that government's going to do it better. It's just a really hard sell. They say, have you been to the Bureau of Auto, the Department of Auto, of your licensing bureaus and so forth recently? Have you seen our bridges? Have you, and so forth. And in theory, this is an answer, but in practice, it's a hard sell politically.
So I have one more question. We're going to keep it quick, and then we'll get on to lunch. Angus?
I agree with a lot of what I've heard, and I think there really has been a serious change in power towards employers in the low-wage labor market. I think monopsony is much more important than economists have thought about. I think economists have also been responsible for a lot of the changing legal decisions in which economics and law movement has played a large part. So, I think professional economists do bear a lot of the blame here. But none of you actually said what I said last night, and I think is very important, so I'll say it very quickly again, which is that the cost of healthcare is pushing down wages because employers don't really care whether they pay it in healthcare or whether they pay it in wages. And I think, there's hardly decisive work, but it makes sense, and there's good work showing that that's what actually happens. So it comes out of wages, and it's also largely responsible for the outsourcing, which is the creation of really bad jobs. Because if you have to pay 20 grand a year for a family employment policy, and it's not just health is a big part of it, but so are 401ks and so are other things that employers have to do. And that's why these Marriott workers are not working for Marriott anymore, and why the Amazon warehouse guys are not working for Amazon anymore, and all the rest of it. And those are terrible jobs. There's no training in those jobs. There's no ladder of success upwards. They're completely dead-end jobs. And what Heidi talked about, the wage theft and so on, those places are infamous for wage theft and for all this stuff. So we're forcing workers into these places, and some of it is the cost side for the employer.
Just a quick comment. One of the more cynical but positive attributes of the federal job guarantee is I suspect that the private sector will insist on the federal government taking over the entire financing of healthcare.
So my quick comment is, think about the example we heard about UBI, a 20% flat tax, whatever, covering this thing called $12,000, and just relabel it healthcare, and I think you could buy it's much more plausible. And it would have, as you point out, for many people, especially people at the bottom, make a huge difference in terms of the labor market and so forth. So to me, that's where I'd like my universal basic income to be focused.
I'm good. I won't stand between everyone and lunch.
Okay. Well, with that, thank you all.